Well, old chap, I am glad I am wounded to get out of that hell. These words were written in 1915 by Albert Edwin Rippington, a railway auditor turned soldier, from his hospital bed in France. Now imagine a similar letter, carried across seas by men from India or Africa, soldiers who fought under an empire that did not see them as equals. In this story, we'll follow several of their letters, hear what they tried to share, and see how censorship shaped what their families received. But before their words, ask yourself, whose faces do we usually picture when we think of the Great War? The story of the Great War stretches far wider than most images suggest. Beyond the trenches of Flanders and the posters filled with European faces, the conflict drew its strength from lands far away. Its reach was global, not only in the fighting, but in the sheer number of men uprooted from Asia, Africa, and beyond. More than 2 million soldiers and labourers from India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and other territories were recruited into the imperial war machine. It was this vast contribution of manpower that made the war truly worldwide. Their stories, however, rarely carried into the versions of history that followed. The British Army leaned heavily on its empire to fill its ranks. Recruiting sergeants and colonial officials scoured villages, towns, and fields across the globe, relying on persuasion, pressure, or promises that often blurred into coercion. From Punjab's farmlands, Bengal's rice paddies, Nepal's hill stations, and Kenya's coastal towns, men were drawn in, given uniforms, drilled in languages they did not always understand, and shipped across oceans into battles whose purposes were distant from their own lives. The French and Belgian empires did the same, drawing tens of thousands from North and West Africa, while Southeast Asian men followed the currents of colonial administrations into Europe and the Middle East. Each contingent carried its own languages, customs, and food traditions, yet they were folded into armies designed with the European soldier as the norm. On lists and recruitment tables, those numbers feel like abstractions, but place yourself in one moment. A Punjabi sepoy standing in the grey mud of northern France, his shoulders damp beneath a thin wool tunic, the rain turning his turban heavy. The air is colder than anything he has known, and even the word trench has to be learned. He is not a solitary figure. Entire units like his stood at the front, not as auxiliaries or distant support, but in the thick of the war, from patrols to attacks, from digging roads to holding the line under shell fire. Their hands built bridges, carried ammunition, dug positions, and their names filled casualty rolls for towns they had never imagined until the ships carried them there. India alone provided more manpower than all other British colonies and dominions combined. This was possible because India already had a vast professional army, a large recruitment base, and a system of administration ready to channel men into wartime service. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, giving the Western Front its earliest reinforcements in the desperate autumn of 1914. When Indian Expeditionary Force A disembarked at Marseille in late September that year, they were cheered through French streets before being pressed almost immediately into action. Within weeks they fought at Ypres, and by March 1915 they were in the thick of the battle at Neuve-Chapelle. In their letters they told of the mud and cold, of longing for familiar foods, and of battles that shook the ground itself. Left behind were villages strained by the absence of so many working-age men, farms run by women and elders trying to survive a war waged continents away. French West Africa, too, carried a heavy share. The tirailleurs Sénégalais were sent in significant numbers to Europe, often arriving in bleak landscapes that seemed unreal to those who had never known frost. Their commanders praised them as fearless fighters in brutal charges, yet denied them dignity in wages, treatment, and recognition. Still, they fought on, leaving behind letters that spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and the cold as its own enemy. In some cases, men wrote of seeing snow for the first time, describing it as a force almost as confusing as German artillery. Farther south, in East Africa, the war unfolded as a roving campaign across vast distances. Here, African labourers became the backbone of supply lines, carrying ammunition, food and weapons over long marches across plains, forests and mountains. Known as porters, they were not enlisted soldiers and often lacked any of the protections an official army might give. Thousands died of exhaustion, disease and neglect. They seldom appear in war memorials, yet their labour made possible every skirmish and advance in the region. Theirs is a story catalogued more in oral memory than in documents, for officials rarely recorded their names. The scale of these contributions raises a painful question. Why are their faces absent from official memory? Simply put, histories written in Europe after the war privileged European sacrifice. Textbooks, monuments, and centenary commemorations centered the trenches of northern France as though the entire war was confined there. To acknowledge colonial troops equally would have required admitting that Europe had been dependent on its empire, and that dependence threatened to make claims of superiority ring hollow. Recognition was not granted. Instead, contributions from Asia and Africa slipped into footnotes, if not silence. Yet silence in history does not mean silence at the time. These soldiers spoke, wrote, and tried to make sense of the war in ways that reached their families across incredible distances. They wrote in Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Arabic, Swahili, and countless other languages. They described the days, the food, the danger, and the longing to return home. A letter written at the edge of battle could reach a mother in Bengal or a brother in West Africa, except that along the way it would be stopped, read, and judged. Every letter carried risk. The imperial governments feared that too much honesty about the horrors of the front might discourage further recruitment or foment unrest in villages still expected to supply men. So each line, written in the mud of France or the mountains of the Balkans, was intercepted. Censors decided which phrases could pass and which were too dangerous, reshaping the connection between soldier and family. A description of corpses or shortages might simply never reach the village where his parents waited. Sometimes even simple words about despair were cut out. What survives today in archives is because of this surveillance. Translations, copies and notes made by clerks whose aim was to monitor morale and detect dangerous sentiment. Look again at the numbers. More than 2 million men recruited across the empire. They stood in trenches and camps, carried stretchers, built rail lines, faced artillery, and frozen fields they never chose. Yet despite their essential role, official portrayals of the war shrank their visibility until it was nearly invisible. Absence became its own kind of evidence, proof of how deliberately memory can be narrowed, but let us complicate that narrative. Even censored, they leave behind fragments of the truth, honest glimpses of war filtered through fear and love, frustration and hope. The weight of this silence makes those surviving words even more vital. What remains are voices marked by ink and intercepted by authorities, but still carrying pieces of what men wanted their families to know. Every phrase, even clipped or crossed out, carries traces of authenticity. The act of surveillance, designed to manage empire, instead preserved humanity that might otherwise have been lost. The war becomes global not only in numbers, but in the spread of private words, messages written in countless scripts from hands that trembled with cold or fatigue. These fragments place us at the edge of something intimate. To hold such a letter is to hear a man describe his day in a few sentences, to feel the distance he carried inside, and to realize the empire itself considered his words dangerous. Before those pages could ever reach a father in a village or a wife by the river, they were opened. They were judged. And in that moment, another story begins. One where soldiers' testimonies became objects of translation, inspection, and control. In northern France, a young sepoy sat with paper balanced on his knees. The trench wall his only desk. He wrote slowly in Urdu, line after line, intended for his father in a distant Punjab village. He described the damp earth, the strange silence after the guns paused, and the prayers that helped him endure. What he could not know was that his words, before reaching home, would first be delivered in sacks to a low building in Boulogne, where they were opened, inspected, and rewritten in English for officers who would never meet him. That building, the Indian base post office in Boulogne, was the largest translation and censorship hub of its time. Inside, the work was brisk and impersonal. Former colonial administrators, interpreters, and India hands filled long tables with piles of folded paper. Each day, new bundles arrived, filled with letters in Urdu, Hindi, Gurmukhi, Bengali, Pashto, Punjabi, Swahili, or Arabic. The job was not to preserve intimacy, but to process, to read aloud in another language, and to prepare summaries for the British command. Translators did not simply copy. They wrote weekly reports drawn from recurring themes in the letters: what soldiers feared, what they praised, how morale shifted from one regiment or region to another. This was not only censorship, it was a way of monitoring morale across the empire. The instructions were clear. To read a letter was not to listen for tenderness, but to weigh risk. A cheerful note about food or mention of good pay could pass without comment. A line describing trenches waist deep in water, or a comrade lost in shellfire, was underlined and marked. In the margins, clerks used the same words again and again: unreliable, bad moral tone, seditious. Entire passages might be excised. A page of neat script was reduced to a short extract. The rest either destroyed or filed. Families waiting at home assumed their sons had fallen silent for weeks at a time, never knowing their letters had been written and stopped. It was not only the words that were classified. Each letter was logged with the soldier's name, regiment, religion, and region. Sikh grenadiers, Muslim cavalry, Hindu sepoys, all were assigned stereotypes drawn from colonial files, each judged differently in terms of reliability. A doubt whispered by one group was weighed as more hazardous than the same doubt from another. Letters became not only censored messages, but statistical entries sorted by identity and turned into intelligence. For the translator, the position was peculiar. The task required fluency, yet intimacy was stripped away. What one man wrote to his mother became reduced to bullet points on a page marked "Report on native letters received." For officials, this was necessary for security. For the families, it meant their closest bonds were overseen by strangers with pens in hand. One sharp truth sits in this alone. The letters of colonial soldiers were never private. Yet censors did not block everything. Many letters still went home, though clipped of their sharpest truths. A despairing half-paragraph might simply be blacked out, leaving a sudden silence on the page. Others preserved only standard greetings and blessings, giving parents little more than the opening and ending, without the life in between. Imagine holding such a letter, recognizing your son's handwriting, but seeing blank spaces where his thoughts should be. Families filled those gaps with their own hopes, while officials had already judged those words too dangerous. The material that officials chose to let through is as revealing as what they withheld. They encouraged stories of loyalty, faith in the king, and comfort on the Western Front. When men praised French food, wrote fondly of European landscapes, or assured family all was well, those words sped quickly to their destination. But lines that admitted exhaustion or hinted at heavy losses were halted or reshaped. By controlling this flow, the censors manufactured a version of war that reassured, keeping enlistment steady and villages quiet. Still, the purpose went beyond suppression. Because everything was processed, copies and translations accumulated. Weekly summaries circulated to British officers responsible for recruitment policy. The same letters that never reached mothers or wives produced intelligence briefs measuring morale in entire districts of India or provinces of Africa. A private note became part of a larger surveillance map of the empire, and because the documents were stored, much of that archive survives in files today. Letters that were stopped in 1915 are read in libraries a century later. Consider the paradox. Surveillance intended to prevent unrest has preserved memory. Without the Bologna office, countless letters would have vanished at sea or been lost during retreat. Instead, many remain on thin sheets of paper, translations clipped to originals, with notes in English explaining what officers should conclude. These surviving scraps reveal how men described life on the front lines in their own terms, never meant for outsiders to read. Yet some soldiers were not naive. They knew their letters were opened. A blunt admission about hunger or cold could disappear en route. So many found new strategies. They used familiar images, harvests, spices, weather to hint at what they dared not write directly. To families, such language could be easily understood. To officials, it might pass as harmless detail. In that hidden layer, truth still travelled. The translation room at Boulogne was therefore a site of constant negotiation. On the surface, it resembled an office with ink and tables. At its core, it was where empire sought control over human voices, and where soldiers still pressed for a chance to be heard. For mothers and fathers opening envelopes far away, the words they saw were already altered, carefully measured by those clerks. But folded inside many of those letters were metaphors and coded images, ways for men at the front to send truths that slipped through the gaps of censorship. Those quiet adaptations were not official, nor were they written in secret ink. They rested in ordinary language, veiled in proverbs, food, farming, or family metaphors. To the censor, the words seemed safe. To a mother or brother, they carried another meaning entirely. And that is where the story continues. To understand what soldiers truly said, we must follow the subtle codes they created when every line home was a risk. If letters were always intercepted by censors, then the soldier's greatest task was to write in ways that could be understood at home, yet slip past foreign eyes. Every sentence had to balance safety with truth, affection with alarm. To succeed, men created codes, shaped ordinary words into parables, or carried meaning beneath the surface of everyday talk. Indian soldiers, in particular, became known for layering metaphors in their correspondence. Farming imagery was one of the easiest codes. A sepoy describing his unit as the fields that refused to grow was not given a quaint report about agriculture, but signalling heavy losses. A campaign could become a delayed harvest, a poor battle, a ruined crop. To the British clerk translating, such descriptions seemed bland, even cheerful. In a Punjabi village, however, these metaphors spoke clearly of fatigue and death. Families knew the rhythm of soil as well as the rhythm of life, and they could read between those lines. Food and spices gave another kind of language. One striking phrase compared British officers to red pepper and Indian comrades to black pepper. On the page it looked playful, but in context it pointed to hierarchy. Red pepper was sharp, fiery and dominant. Black pepper blended and supported. The metaphor let soldiers talk about inequality without ever writing words like unfair or racist. For families used to flavour as a measure of strength, the meaning was obvious. Censors understood at times that they were reading more than surface words. Reports from the Boulogne office even noted that soldiers composed full parables in which characters stood for entire nations. One example, described by Pathan soldiers, told of their 5 figures. The first was Germany, the second Austria, the third Turkey, the fourth Britain, and the fifth France. The story unfolded as a kind of fable, but underneath it mapped alliances and rivalries. To censors, it was a curiosity. To families, it was politics set as folklore, a way of grasping world events without naming them directly. The stakes in letter writing could not be overstated. For soldiers, this was often their only lifeline across seas. To talk honestly about despair, hunger, or casualties could mean the letter never reached home. Yet complete silence would fracture bonds too. The coded language became collaboration between writer and reader, a method of survival for the relationship itself. Families, hearing familiar idioms, pieced together the truth, like threads in a cloth. If a son wrote that the cattle are weak this year, no one believed it was only about animals. Everyone who listened knew it meant thin rations and sick men. Some lines worked like proverbs. To say a storm has settled did not refer to rain, but to the pounding of artillery. The rivers are dry might speak not of climate, but of the long thirst during supply shortages. Rooted in the imagery of home, such words invited a second reading by any parent or uncle. A censor, focused on catching direct statements of complaint, let those metaphors float past. Across villages, fathers reading aloud under neem or banyan trees spread these messages further. The letters did not stay private, but became shared testimony. Neighbours leaned in, catching tone as much as words. A letter that began with bread, cows, or ploughing became a communal riddle. Everyone knew that the soldier was present in spirit, even if what he sent had been trimmed or softened by unknown clerks. This was a gentler kind of defiance. It did not shout or refuse orders. Instead, it infused empires' monitored pipelines with private meaning. Soldiers trusted their families to hear them properly. That trust itself was rebellion, to write for the people back home, not for the censors in France. Sometimes coded letters took forms of poems. A couplet could sound patriotic, yet carry grief in a turn of phrase. Repetition could hint at monotony, the grinding days of fatigue. Song lyrics transcribed into writing doubled as subtle indicators of sadness or fear. Families attuned to tone knew when words of joy were hollow. Such invention was striking because many soldiers came with little formal schooling. Still, they used the strongest tools available. Their culture's imagery of crops, rivers, spices, livestock, prayers. On a page, those references looked innocent. To the right listener, they were cries for recognition. Every folded note was not just a family greeting, but a compact codebook written in trust. Not everything was erased by censorship either. Translators were often instructed to adopt a relatively liberal policy, passing much of what seemed harmless. It was only explicit political agitation, sexual material, or openly seditious writing that was consistently blocked. This nuance mattered. Soldiers could still share genuine details of cold, food, or even fear, as long as they remained indirect. Censorship muted them, but it did not strip them of all voice. Other strategies appeared as well. Reports noted attempts at backward writing or scraps of hidden text, even rumours of invisible ink. Families and soldiers also looked for ways around official mail, sometimes passing letters through French friends or civilian routes to escape censorship. These alternate paths were rare, but pointed to the same instinct, finding ways for truth to reach home despite layers of surveillance. What truth survived? In coded form, soldiers wrote sorrow for comrades already buried or missing. They hinted at shortages, at the endless weight of drills, even the blunt terror of shells. A delayed marriage became a metaphor for lives cut by death. Crops ruined by drought stood in for battalions broken by fire. Every family who unravelled these words understood more than the page directly said. Picture a household in Punjab or Bengal, a mat spread on the floor, a letter unfolded, children quiet in the corners. An older uncle's voice slowed when he reached the phrase, "The trees are bare of leaves." None needed further guidance. It meant exhaustion, despair, or winter cold, a feeling the soldier could not state outright. In this collective listening, families carried their absent son a little closer. Often, letters opened with formulas designed to satisfy censors at once. "I am well, food is good," before shifting tone. What followed could be simple talk of weeds in the fields or barren orchards, but families heard more. They read concern between the lines, sorrow disguised as routine description. Thousands of such letters crossed seas, carrying both safety and warning. There were gaps and failures too. Sometimes families could not decipher the intended meanings, or they misread them as optimism, when in fact the soldier felt despair. Codes were imperfect, but even in uncertainty, the act of writing them showed imagination outpaced control. It was a hope, a gesture that built connection despite the filters of empire. And so, these letters became testimonies of resilience. They revealed two levels of speech, the surface line meant for authority, and the deeper passage reserved for loved ones. One could pass through censorship, the other could only live in a household's careful listening. This was not cleverness alone, but dignity, the choice to carry on speaking as sons, brothers, fathers. Today, when we see them in archives, the letters appear in translation with notes beside them. Much of the coded texture was invisible to the clerks who wrote the summaries, but if read with context, the imagery of season, spice, weather, the layers return to life. Between the lines, we glimpse individuals speaking against silence. In that persistence lay quiet strength. Coded words gave men back some control over their own story, even when they stood far from home in frozen trenches or dry deserts. Each metaphor was an act of courage, folded into paper that carried across seas. From this shared language of hidden meaning, we turn now to a single letter. It does not survive only as a set of codes, but as a direct voice from a known battlefield, shaped by a particular man's hand at a particular moment in war. Picture a rifleman from Punjab, his boots heavy with wet earth that clung to every step as he leaned into the side of a trench. The evening had grown quiet after a day of scattered fire, and in the fragile hush he pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket. The lantern beside him flickered, uneven light falling as his pen scratched slow lines onto the page. Around him some men whispered prayers, others smoked, their rifles stacked nearby. Each word he wrote was a bridge, a way to carry himself across the miles to a family waiting at home. It was March 1915, and just days before he had stood in the mud fields near Neuve-Chapelle, one of the war's first great encounters for newly arrived Indian troops. The Indian Corps, made up of the Lahore and Meerut divisions, had landed in France in late 1914. Their numbers grew quickly, swelling to 4 divisions by the time the fighting reached its height, before they were finally withdrawn at the end of 1915. At Neuve-Chapelle, they fought alongside British units in an offensive meant to break German positions. For many, it was the first time they had faced sustained machine gun fire and endless artillery barrages, industrial battle as none of them had ever seen. In the thick fog of that March offensive, attacks surged and faltered, and Indian units suffered heavy casualties in those few days. Losses marked not only individual families, but entire villages emptied of their sons. The soldier's letter from that moment carried more than one voice. To the censor in Boulogne it rang loyal and encouraging. He wrote respectfully of his officers, assured his father that discipline remained intact, and described his regiment's part in the battle without complaint. Lines like these were precisely what the British hoped to see: faithful troops who confirmed the colonial narrative of courage and composure. Yet reading more closely, between phrases of duty, fatigue explodes in quiet detail. He described trenches that stank after rainfall, places where mud sucked at boots until each step felt like ploughing through wet fields at home. The rain that soaked his turban never seemed to lift, chilling him to the bone. He wrote of military rations, dense bread, strange tinned meat that made his stomach restless. In scattered phrases, he admitted that what he longed for more than rest was a single cup of milk tea, the taste of home carried in memory. On the page, these seemed like harmless mentions of food, but for a father listening in Punjab, they would have meant more than appetite. Familiar words about tea or family meals translated into a cry for comfort across distance. This is what letters like his reveal: a life caught between expressions of loyalty and the strain of survival. The official image of the brave sepoy, always obedient, never weary, dissolves as soon as we hear him speak of cold nights and unsettled stomachs. Instead of a single voice praising empire, we hear 2 at once: pride in belonging to his regiment and a private weariness that he could only hint at in phrases about home. Back in Punjab, his words likely reached a father who read them aloud under the shade of a tree, by the fields, as neighbours leaned close. When he mentioned officers and discipline, they nodded in recognition of duty. But when he spoke of tea and warmth, the silence between lines carried its own meaning. Families understood not only what was written, but what was withheld. They listened for the spaces, the pauses where truth was allowed only to breathe quietly beneath censor's ink. The battle that had framed his writing remains notorious in military histories for its tactical problems. Orders misfired, communication lines broke down, artillery preparation proved both powerful and insufficient. Neuve-Chapelle has often been retold as a lesson in logistics and planning. Yet the sepoy's letter offers a different record. For him, the defining force was not theory of warfare, but the unrelenting cold, the strange food, the effort to keep faith, while exhaustion settled into every bone. That contrast between military textbooks and personal voices shows why his words demand our attention more than statistics. When he folded that fragile paper and smoothed the ink with tired hands, he entrusted more than information. He handed over survival to the journey of a letter making its way across seas. Writing confirmed that he still belonged to someone beyond the trench. Without his words, he was only a number in a ledger of casualties, but with them he became once again a son, a brother, a man looking for connection. Reports from the field recount that fog lingered throughout those days, hide in advance and forcing men forward without seeing far ahead. Communication faltered, units stumbled through ruined villages, and the wounded often lay stranded for hours before reaching medical posts. In such a battle, men like him were asked to continue fighting as if endurance itself were endless. That he managed still to pause, set his pen to paper, and assure his father of his safety, even when echoes of bombardment rang in his ears, speaks not to naivety, but to determination to hold those ties firm. His letter remains valuable not because it offers tactical information, but because it collapses the gap between known history and lived truth. It resists the simplification of colonial memory. In the public sphere, Neuve-Chapelle was hailed in Britain as proof of India's loyalty, a success paraded in headlines and brief mentions of martial races fighting shoulder to shoulder with empire. In private, men wrote of mud that swallowed boots, of nights without sleep, of food that brought no comfort. That duality, public praise and private endurance, is why a single surviving letter can matter as much as an entire speech in Parliament. The humanity in his words runs deeper than heroics or defiance. There is pride, yes, a willingness to fulfill his role as a soldier, but alongside it, a longing that does not vanish in service. These letters do not erase his sense of duty, nor do they erase his weariness. They hold both together. That balancing act is in itself a testimony against neat historical labels. What the rifleman at Neuve-Chapelle wrote cannot be separated from the larger story of Indian troops in France. His letter echoes the voices of thousands who filled the ranks of the Lahore and Meerut divisions, feeding into campaigns that demanded more than soldiers had thought possible when they left home in 1914. Withdrawn only at the end of the following year, they endured through Ypres, Festubert, Loos, and other fronts that carved out the memory of war in Europe. His lines, preserved and translated, carry fragments of that greater burden in miniature form. If we listen closely, his words are not frozen in the mud of northern France. They invite comparison to other voices written in drastically different landscapes. The mud of trenches and the fog of northern Europe were only one setting of the war. Across continents, other Indian soldiers picked up pens in contrasting climates, on marches through deserts where thirst and heat shrank the space for reflection. Men also reached for paper to tell their families what the war felt like there. And just as milk tea or damp soil marked one man's truth in France, the sting of dry winds and burning sun shaped testimonies written far to the east. In Mesopotamia, even the act of setting pen to paper was altered. Ink dried too quickly under the unforgiving sun, the strokes crisp and brittle rather than smeared as they often were on the Western Front. Soldiers noticed these small differences immediately. Paper and writing behaved strangely as the landscape itself. They were no longer in trenches filled with rain, but on marches across terrain that cracked under their boots. Heat and dust reached them first, long before the enemy's bullets did, and the letters home carried these burdens in every line. The Indian Expeditionary Force was sent up from Basra, first stepping onto shores haunted by fever, flies and shortages, before pushing further inland toward towns marked on maps with little meaning to the men themselves. Soldiers wrote of canvas tents pitched along riverbanks and endless treks across featureless ground. Their families, reading these notes weeks later, imagined places they had never heard of and climates nearly impossible to picture. One letter described days that were day and night in the saddle, a phrase that captured both exhaustion and geography without directly naming defeat. The campaigns stretched toward Khyber and beyond, with days spent under blazing horizons and nights where soldiers collapsed into shallow trenches scraped into the earth. A rifleman's page might mention little beyond thirst. He remembered canal waters in Punjab, not because he was homesick for scenery, but because his cracked lips and parched throat placed that absence before him all day. The words meant one thing to the censor, idle nostalgia, and something far more urgent to the family who heard them read aloud. Food was another refrain. Bread was tough, flour filled with weevils, and tea, when it could be made, lacked milk. Such complaints seemed small, even mundane, but they were ways of saying that the men felt displaced both in body and spirit. In their kitchens at home, families understood that longing for proper food was not mere fussiness, but an expression of weakness and lack of strength. One man wrote simply that he remembered warm bread from home, and his father would have known that such words were a cry of weariness, a need for nourishment that was not being met. Disease struck as harshly as the heat. Dysentery and fever removed more men from action than shells. Letters did not often state this outright, but they carried indirect signals, phrases about weakness in the camp, or dozens sent away ill. Families understood, even if the censors let such lines pass. To hear of sickness was harder to absorb than mention of battle, for it spoke of something unrelenting, invisible, and stretching across entire regiments. It was not only climate that gnawed at men, it was policy. One grievance in particular survived in the letters and in reports preserved at Boulogne: the treatment of the wounded. Indian soldiers protested being sent back into the line after barely recovering from illness or injury. Omissi records that they even circulated a petition to the king, pleading for fair treatment and for the right not to be dispatched again into certain hardship once their bodies were weakened. That such a petition was ever sent reflects the desperation of men who had run out of patience with unhearing officers. Their words at once challenged authority and preserved the fact that they never stopped trying to be heard, even in conditions stacked against them. The battles themselves often unfolded with little mercy for either side. At Khyber, the terrain was exposed and left men fevered beneath open skies. A year later, the siege of Kut al-Amara carried the campaign to its breaking point. Townshend's force endured months cut off from supply before finally surrendering in April 1916, when 13,000 soldiers laid down their arms. It was one of the most significant defeats of British arms in the war, and for the Indian troops trapped in Kut, it meant captivity, marches as prisoners, and a silence in the correspondence that families back home would never fully understand. Letters that did reach home from these campaigns highlight striking differences from those written in Europe. In France, one reads of rain that never stopped and mud that froze hands stiff. In Mesopotamia, ink dried in seconds and soldiers spoke of dust storms that swallowed whole camps. These geographic details were not background, they were the heart of the message. Soldiers needed their families to know where they really were, not in mythic lands of bravery, but in deserts where water was survival itself. One sepoy wrote of canals at home, the sound of water coursing through fields. Censors treated this as casual description, yet for families in Punjab, that sentence was laden with alarm. Their son was writing about thirst in metaphors of irrigation. The letters transformed geography into a shared language of pain. Where mud and rain signalled danger in France, canals and rivers unmentioned in Mesopotamia told of bodies breaking down, memory and sensation interlocked, enabling families to understand what officials could not. Think for a moment of the moment of writing. Men crouched in canvas tents, sweat still running even in the darkest hours, scratching out words under weak lantern light. Outside, comrades lay fevered, and inside, the paper stiffened with crisp lines that were more permanent than the writer himself might prove to be. Families unfolded these letters by courtyards in distant villages, weeks later, not knowing whether the writer had survived since posting them. The words maintained their sharpness, even if the man's life had dimmed or ended. Histories remembered primarily the Western Front, yet the Mesopotamian campaigns drained thousands of lives through climate, disease, and battles often overshadowed in Europe and later anniversaries. These letters restore the balance, reminding us that the war's geography cannot be drawn in barbed wire alone. The desert and river valleys became equally defining, their hardships woven into personal testimonies carried across seas. What unites these stories with those from France is not the landscape, but the intimacy of writing. Soldiers used images their families could grasp: bread, tea, canals, the aching body longing for relief. And always behind such words was the refusal to fall silent. Even when censors watched each sheet, even when sickness silenced entire regiments, they found ways to keep words moving homeward. As these letters circulated, cartographies expanded in village courtyards. Families who had never heard of Basra or Kut knew those names because their children wrote them down, gave them life, made them real. They spread beyond the battlefield into collective knowledge, remaking memory of the war into something broader than textbooks allowed. And still, the story was not confined here. Letters did not only move between Asia and the deserts of Mesopotamia. Another set of journeys was underway, one that placed men from African homelands into Europe itself. Their voices, when they stepped down from trains into strange stations, added yet another layer to this story of war scattered across the globe. It is with them that we turn next. Imagine a Senegalese tirailleur stepping off a train into Balkan snow, hearing for the first time the crunch of frozen ground beneath his boots. The air is heavy with a cold that pierces his coat, and smoke rising from chimneys clings to a sky so grey it feels alien. For a man used to the heat of African seasons, the sensation seems almost otherworldly. Hands that once worked farmland now grasp at a rifle made heavier by the bitter climate. He stands not alone, but as part of thousands mobilized by France. Men drawn from Senegal and across West Africa, others from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, even Indochina. The empire moved them by ship to Marseille, and then northward by train, until they found themselves in rural villages and mountain passes, landscapes without resemblance to anything they had ever known. France raised these colonial troops quickly. Recruiting agents promised pay, honour, and in some vague cases, the recognition that might resemble citizenship. Many volunteered with pride, others joined under pressure of quotas and persuasion, and soon entire battalions wore French uniforms, drilled in unfamiliar commands, and followed orders that carried them straight into Europe's war. To the French state, their presence symbolized world power, an army that could call on men from across continents. To the soldiers themselves, it meant sudden dislocation, stripped from familiar soil and cast into a struggle far removed from village fields or urban neighborhoods back home. The reputation they gained was contradictory. On one hand, they were praised in official proclamations for endurance, loyalty, and combat spirit. On the other, they were all too often placed in the deadliest positions. French commanders, facing stalemate, deployed North and West African battalions as assault units intended to break through fortified lines. Military records confirm that colonial regiments were sometimes sent forward first, used as shock troops to wear down German defences before European divisions advanced. The outcome was predictable: high casualties, disproportionate loss, and the knowledge among surviving men that their lives were valued differently. Letters home reveal both pride and quiet resentment in equal measure. Some soldiers spoke of honour, of being able to tell their families they had marched under the tricolour, claiming a place in the history of France itself. Others described hunger, pay delayed or withheld, and a gnawing awareness that rewards were fewer for them than for their French comrades. Rations, too, made the hierarchy visible. Soldiers who queued for bread after freezing marches found European units receiving loaves still warm from ovens, while by the time the same loaves reached colonial hands, they were cold, stale, or shrunken. A small detail, but its symbolism was enormous. To a censor in Paris or Boulogne, such a complaint appeared minor. To a family hearing it read aloud by lamplight, it confirmed that their sons were not treated the same. Culture added its own distance. Soldiers from West Africa described landscapes stripped bare by winter, branches empty of leaves, a world where darkness came too early. They tried to convey in words how strange it felt to breathe vapour into the air, to see it hang there like smoke. North African regiments struggled with observances, prayer times disregarded or interrupted under orders. Indo-Chinese recruits wrote about the endless travel across towns whose names blurred together, places foreign to their tongues and devoid of familiar markers. Isolation appeared even in moments of daily routine. And yet, within this strangeness, flashes of kindness survived. A surviving letter recalls a night when icy winds crept through bedding. A soldier wrapped cloth tighter around thin legs and mentioned, almost casually, that local villagers had offered them warm wine. Polite acceptance of something unfamiliar gave relief, and the memory of that singular sharing stayed with him when he wrote home. Such gestures did not fix the underlying inequalities, but they lingered in memory because they reminded men that not every interaction came through the uniform of command. Sometimes it was children waving, women offering bread, or small markets providing food and warmth that punctured otherwise cold routines. The letters reveal how men carried two voices in the same envelope. They recorded welcome from civilians, thanks for smiles or laughter, and gratitude for fleeting hospitality. Yet they also unflinchingly noted exclusion, the sting of being denied equal pay, the knowledge of being sent first into exposed assaults, or the silence that followed requests for fairness. They did not ignore the contradiction. They layered pride and pain together in the same handwriting. This is what historians have since called a double bind, valued enough to fight in the name of the Republic, but not enough to be given the dignity of equal footing. Picture again that soldier in snow. He sat in a barn, candle fluttering in the draught, fingers stiff as he tried to write to family in Senegal. Into sentences about his health and prayer, he may have woven hints about his discontent, or perhaps he hid them for fear of censorship. Yet his readers would have known, families listening gathered meaning not only from visible words, but from pauses, omissions, and tone. A line about survival, followed closely by one about lacking proper bread, said enough. They understood the silence as much as the speech. What did these men imagine for their reward when the war ended? Some believed sacrifice alongside French comrades might prove their worth, glimpsing a future where their citizenship could be acknowledged. Others doubted it more openly, already noting in letters that the treatment proved otherwise. When the war concluded, those doubts were justified. Recognition often remained anonymous. Numbers of dead rather than names, mention of colonial battalions with little distinction, monuments raised in Europe that their families might never see. The Republic did not extend broad new rights in return for the blood given in France's fields and mountains. Their correspondence tells of the wound of deferred hope. It was one thing to carry hunger, to endure frost on long marches. It was another to wrestle with the possibility that service and loyalty might still leave them in the same status as before. Families back in West Africa or North Africa needed no official source to grasp this disappointment. Reading letters beneath small lamps or in courtyards, they heard the weariness clothed in code, loyalty written in one line, and grievance in another. After the armistice, the reactions to their presence in Europe showed the contradictions stretched beyond France. In occupied Germany, the sight of African troops among the French forces sparked racist propaganda known as the Black Shame campaign. German pamphlets and news stories depicted their presence in the Rhineland as an outrage, spreading international debates steeped in prejudice. For the soldiers themselves, it was another reminder that their service, so real in its risks, was filtered through hostile lenses they never controlled. In those years, history recorded their regiments but not their individuality. It is only in letters that their personal voices echo, carrying both pride and critique. Lines praising discipline, words thankful for comradeship, appear alongside notes about injustice, fatigue, and the cold that never eased. The contrast is striking because it refuses a simple story. They were not blindly loyal, nor were they purely bitter. They lived inside contradiction, and they wrote it down. Families preserved those contradictions. They read them together in villages where neighbours gathered, each hearing the mixture of pride and frustration. For communities far away, the letters became both proof of courage and testimony of inequity. The voices preserved on fragile paper travelled across oceans, threaded into memory not through official ceremonies alone, but through private listening in homes. It is important to recognise that the war reshaped knowledge of the world for these men. Many had never imagined Europe, never imagined snow, never imagined villages of stone where people spoke languages so alien. They were forced into worlds unchosen and found themselves narrating them through letters that carried across seas. Their absence from grand memory books does not erase the fact that in reality they were here, in trenches, in mountains, in towns, fighting wars not originally theirs. What their letters leave us is testimony that the Great War was never a European story alone. It was a patchwork bound together by men from deserts, forests, coastlines, and hills far beyond France or Germany. To read their words is to understand that empire made the conflict global, and to remember that these personal sentences are as essential as the official histories that recorded only battles and treaties. And yet, not every letter traced injustice or war tactics. Many waited for families by focusing on the smallest fragments of survival: boots, socks, bread, or quiet prayers before sleep. In these ordinary details lies another side of the story, the one written not in victories, but in the daily rhythm of life, carried through years of uncertainty. Not every letter carried news of fighting. Some mentioned socks worn thin, or boots rubbing the skin raw after long marches. Others described brief pauses for prayer, carried out far from mosques or temples. A few spoke of food as memory rather than fact, a taste of rice, or the remembered scent of bread from home ovens, written down more vividly than the sound of cannons. Families held tightly to these understated notes. A line about clothing suggested the writer still walked, still lived. A request for a simple ingredient meant his thoughts turned toward comfort and routine, not only survival. Soldiers used such details as proof of life. To tell his sister that his boots were failing was more than a complaint. It said he was still moving, his body still present in the struggle. To ask about a festival back home was not casual politeness, but a reminder that his days continued to move alongside the rhythms of his community. Each mention of daily life, food, clothing, prayer, kept them linked to a world more enduring than the battles consuming their hours. Yet even these personal notes risked removal. Letters went through censors less interested in conversation than in morale. An observation about pay arriving late could be struck out. A remark about thin coats in winter might be dismissed as poor tone. Even ordinary discomforts became suspect if they suggested discouragement. Soldiers knew this. They shaped words carefully, leaving space for families to read what they meant without writing it outright. Hints replaced direct complaints. To say bread is not as it is at home was safer than declaring hunger. A comment that walking is difficult these days stood in for blisters and worn-out boots. Families accustomed to their sons' voices caught the meaning immediately. These adjustments were a form of code, less spectacular than elaborate parables, but just as determined to share something real. Intimacy survived by working around the sensor's threshold. Food was often at the center of those efforts. Indian soldiers described the plain rations, tinned meat, coarse flour, that replaced the lentils, rice, and milk tea familiar to them. A letter that sighed over missing spiced tea communicated more than taste. It spoke to a body unsettled, to strength not fully restored. African troops, too, marked differences in rations, sometimes noting outright when they received poorer portions than their French comrades. The mention of food, which looked trivial to officials summarizing reports, stood for questions of fairness, fatigue, and longing all at once. Faith was another thread. A Sikh soldier might quietly write that he struggled to keep his turban clean in damp conditions, or that prayer was difficult in camp routines. A Muslim soldier from North Africa might mention the absence of any respect for daily rhythms of devotion, or the challenge of fasting when orders allowed no pause. These lines carried dignity as well as difficulty. To write them home was to confirm that, despite distance, he still practiced what identified him. For families listening back in their villages, that was reassurance enough. They could picture their son not simply as a uniform, but as a man still living inside the customs that shaped him. Money tied soldiers to households almost as directly as words. Pay was delayed, reduced, or redirected, and letters regularly contained apologies. A son explained that remittance had not been sent yet, though he promised it would follow. Another described deductions that left him with less than expected. These mentions mattered in ways beyond currency. They showed families that absence did not erase responsibility. The effort to provide remained active, written down, and sent across seas to prove it. Sometimes letters or packages carried small objects alongside words. Coins set aside, pieces of cloth, devotional items, or rare photographs. In households back home, such gifts became treasured possessions. A piece of paper or cloth enclosed in an envelope became a relic, a fragment of a loved one's presence. Neighbours might gather to see it, proof not only of memory but of continued effort to stay tied to family life even from a war zone. Consider the moment a family unfolded such a letter. They may have braced themselves for harsh news, yet found instead a request for socks or an assurance that daily prayers continued. Relief ran through the household. In an environment where war was impossible to imagine, reminders of ordinary habits gave them something to hold. To hear that their son asked about harvests or festivals was grounding. Messages in such small shapes reminded them that he was alive and still invested in their world as much as the one surrounding him abroad. When brothers wrote from the same regiment, the effect doubled. One letter might speak of seeing the other across camps, or of sharing a meal between marches. Together they reassured families that kinship endured within the army's machine. Villages, hearing these letters read aloud, gathered around such details, as though companionship itself helped shield them from fear. Each mention that brothers were together layered further comfort onto lives punctuated by uncertainty. Every one of these letters carried emotional weight beyond its material form. A father listening to mention of torn shoes imagined his son upright, walking still. A mother reading about food pictured him fed. A sibling considering an apology for reduced pay felt the bond of family obligations remain intact across distance. Each page stood for presence, drawn into households through the cadence of a shared reading voice. Widened across archives, small testimonies changed the scale of history. For each record of movement on maps or assault across no man's land, there exist scores of letters speaking only of needles repairing cloth or of trouble finding ritual time for prayer. When viewed together, they correct the temptation to treat colonial soldiers as abstract, as stock figures in propaganda. Instead, we see how life was sustained as men attending to shoes, meals, and spiritual commitments while under the strain of a world war. Imagine a courtyard where these letters were read aloud. Someone who could read Urdu, Arabic, Punjabi, or French sat at the centre, unfolding paper and voicing the words to those who leaned close. Children held the packet, neighbours listened, and elders measured pauses. Each phrase lifted the absent man into the circle of life again. His mention of worn clothes or remembered bread carried as much weight as any military update. For a scattered moment, he rejoined the home he longed for. Even in hospital abroad, soldiers mentioned such ordinary experiences. Indian wounded treated in Brighton's Royal Pavilion wrote of the fine care and the kindness of the King and Queen, sometimes even praising the excellence of arrangements. To their families, these lines meant survival and dignity, but still they arrived under watchful eyes. Even gratitude was filtered, copied into summaries, and stored as part of the Empire's record. By paying attention to these simple letters, we see that war was not lived only on the front lines. It was carried equally in the small accounts of clothing, food, prayer, and remembered traditions. These quiet testimonies humanized the writers, keeping them balanced between soldier and son, subject and self. And yet, even when a letter carried no anger and spoke only of gratitude or requests for comfort, it was still inspected and shaped before reaching its destination. This constant interference left its mark. Soldiers revealed themselves through the smallest words, and still they were judged. That brings us to the question many of them return to again and again: what loyalty meant under such weight, and how far it was tied to their sense of honor and survival. A soldier once began a letter with the words, "I am loyal to my king," a phrase British officers often underlined when they copied translations. Yet in the very next lines, that same man confessed that he dreamt every night of his village and longed to see it again. Placed side by side, those two sentences tell us more than any official proclamation. Loyalty was not a single, fixed state. It was woven from duty, pride, longing, and disappointment, all contained within a single sheet of paper. The British Army framed colonial soldiers through what it called the martial races doctrine. In its logic, certain groups, Punjabis, Sikhs, Gurkhas, some Muslim communities, were deemed naturally brave, reliable, and suited for soldiering. This rationale shaped recruitment sharply. The demand for manpower fell most heavily on Punjab and other so-called martial areas, with Punjabi communities providing a disproportionate share of recruits. For men from these regions, military service carried expectations not only from empire but from a local society, which had been made to tie honour directly to enlistment. Posters and speeches echoed this theme in villages. To send a son brought prestige, to stay behind risked shame. The census records reflect the same assumption, copying out every line that sounded loyal and letting the rest fade into silent margins. But when you read these letters closely, loyalty does not come through as simple obedience. It comes alongside fatigue and quiet notes of grievance. A sepoy might write that he marched under the king's banner without fear, yet in the same letter he observed that his rations caused illness, or that pay was late again, leaving the household back home in difficulty. One soldier wrote of courage in battle, but then asked if moneylenders had troubled his family in his absence. The censors, eager to preserve morale, lifted only the sentences that praised the king. Families who received them recognized both parts, pride and complaint, devotion and worry. Picture a letter being read aloud under a courtyard tree in Punjab. The father swells with pride when his son's words affirm loyalty. Then his brow furrows when he hears the admission of hardship, of hunger, of pay not arriving. Both truths sit together, neither negating the other. This duality was a real condition of service. For these men, loyalty was not blind faith in empire, but an uneasy balance between external duty and the private burdens carried by their families. The concept of Izzat, honor, helps explain this balance. In South Asian traditions, Izzat was not a private quality alone, but something tied to family standing and village reputation. To serve courageously meant upholding that honor. To refuse could invite ridicule. When men wrote of loyalty to the king, they often meant at the same time loyalty to their father's name, to their brothers, to their community's respect. This layered meaning made such letters both declarations of service and assurances that the household standing remained intact. Many letters carried this tone. A Sikh grenadier informed his family that several comrades had died valiantly. adding that they had been buried with due rites so that their names remained honourable. Such details reassured families not only that their sons died bravely, but that the village's Izzat would not be diminished. This was far more urgent on those pages than any affirmation of empire. And yet, within the same correspondence, there were often glimpses of wider hopes. Some soldiers hinted that sacrifice ought to be recognised beyond the battlefield, that the war's end might bring greater respect for India itself. Such lines often appeared as metaphors or indirect phrasing, for censors quickly struck out anything overtly political. Still, one can see their shape in references to better days after this struggle, or speculation that victory might bring more dignity to their families at home. Not every man had entered willingly. Letters reveal that recruitment often came with pressure, sometimes through village quotas or encouragement from landlords aligned with government officials. Soldiers knew this, and they carried into their service an unease with how they had been compelled. Yet once enlisted, Izzat gave them a way to reinterpret that compulsion as pride. To write home was to claim dignity, to remake necessity into duty worth honouring. Grievances appeared alongside these reinterpretations. One particularly important example survives in records from 1915, when wounded Indian soldiers petitioned King George V to protest being sent back to the trenches soon after recovery. Their letter, documented in censorship reports, asked that men be spared from return to battle while still weak. It showed that their loyalty did not mean silent endurance. They were willing to speak out directly against treatment they viewed as unjust. Such appeals complicate any easy reading of obedience. Imagine a wounded sepoy recovering in a field hospital, writing at the edge of his cot as others moaned nearby. He notes for his father that the king and country are kind, but then admits his pay reached home too slowly. He asks if creditors have crowded his brother. In these lines, loyalty is not only abstract, it blends into financial obligation and household survival. Words of honour fold around the stubborn realities of village debt and family need. To families, none of this was contradictory. When a son wrote he upheld the king's dignity, they heard also that he upheld theirs. When he promised not to fail in his duty, they understood he spoke equally of not allowing shame to fall on their name. This natural translation happened in countless households, where loyalty to empire was never read apart from loyalty to kin. Hope itself often sat beside weariness. Men recalled battles in France or the heat of Mesopotamia, yet still ended with a line imagining fields waiting to be planted, children to be seen again, a household to be restored to peace. Others reflected that if the blood of Indians had secured victories for Britain or France, then some measure of recognition ought to follow. Families listening detected those undertones, and such words carry seeds of expectation beyond the war's end. The soldiers' voices show that loyalty was constant negotiation, part honour, part duty, part necessity. Censors highlighted the sentences they needed, but in the spaces around them we hear fatigue, complaint, and hope. Izzat made endurance possible, but awareness of injustice never disappeared. That consciousness surfaced in notes about rations, delayed pay, and petitions from the wounded. Recruitment pressures added further strain. Several recorded cases show that villages faced quotas, with landlords and officials pushing men forward to meet imperial demand. In places like Punjab, the expectations ran deep. To step away risked shaming an entire household. Men carried this awareness in every march and trench. Officially, they were praised as martial races. In reality, they endured disproportionate burdens, converted into strength through the cultural reinforcement of Izzat. Reading these letters today, the outward voice of loyalty appears calculated to satisfy both empire and family. But beneath it lies the internal voice, addressed to fathers, mothers, siblings, where dignity, survival, and aspirations mingled. Through carefully chosen words, men claimed space as more than subjects of empire. They remained tethered to homes and imagined futures. This dual voice carried forward into expectation. The sacrifices pressed a question. What would follow once the war ended? Hints in the letters suggest men hoped for more than their own return. Some looked toward India standing taller. Others imagined debts cleared or families restored to strength. What is consistent is that service pointed towards something beyond the battlefield. So when we read them now, we must hear both halves. Outward, the professions of loyalty censors underlined. Inward, the concessions to hardship, the desire for recognition, the petitioning for fairness, the hope for change. Their words are testimony that loyalty was shaped under strain and always contested by human need. And in the silence between those lines, one begins to sense the horizons stretching further than a battlefield or a salary. A father listening might nod at his son's courage, but he also heard in those coded phrases a vision of what might come after. The life waiting, the fields, the children, perhaps even a different India his son quietly yearned for. The story does not end with loyalty pinned to a uniform. It carries forward into the futures these men imagined whenever they put pen to paper, spelling out promises and hopes too cautious to name directly, but still present in every phrase. What did these men allow themselves to picture when they set ink to paper? Some dreams were cautious, spoken in simple lines, while others stretched quietly toward change. When a sepoy in France wished that his family might one day live in peace after the war, he did not write the word independence, but his hope suggested a world that could not slip back unchanged. Their correspondence traced futures in fragments, survival, reunion, relief from struggle, each written across oceans to keep faith alive. Most hopes stay close to home. A son promised that he would return for a younger sister's marriage. A father described walking with his children once more along a village canal after harvest. A younger brother asked his elder to guard the family's land until he came back to take it over. These small pledges were more than comforts. They reassured households that bonds endured even while their sons fought somewhere far beyond the horizon. Families repeated such words aloud in courtyards and fields, carrying them as evidence that return was possible. Land and livelihood appeared again and again. Some soldiers wrote of rewards they believed might follow loyal service, plots of farmland, relief from debts, or official recognition that could shield their families from hardship. Even vague lines carried weight. In Punjab or Bengal, where land defined survival, hope for a field to call one's own meant stability for generations. To families who read those words carefully, the paper itself became a promise, folded away in bundles of cloth as if security lay pressed inside it. Yet under those personal hopes, dissatisfaction seeped through. Men wrote of comrades lost in large numbers, while recognition seemed uncertain. Some noticed that European soldiers received medals and ceremony, while colonial troops stood by without acknowledgement. One sepoy's line, "Our names are not called in the same way as theirs," was mild on the page but heavy in the ear of any brother or father listening back home. Such hints invited uncomfortable questions. If the empire depended on these men, why was gratitude unevenly given? Letters did not shout these questions, but they whispered them steadily through repetition. Picture how this sounded when read aloud indoors by lamplight. A mother paused as her son promised that he would walk again with her in the garden. A brother leaned close when the line mentioned debts, knowing that repayment bound the absent soldier as firmly as his uniform did. Families took up these details not as abstractions, but as contracts. Neighbours who gathered to listen were reassured. Return was still possible. Burdens might yet be lifted. Hope became an anchor against silence. Debt itself formed a notable thread. Borrowing weighed heavily on many men who left their villages. Wages from soldiering seemed the only chance to pay off creditors. Letters often promised that earnings sent home would release families from obligations. "I will return without chains of debt," one wrote. For households that had struggled under money lenders, this vow carried more significance than lines about the king. It said loyalty abroad was tethered to a deeper loyalty at home. The longer the war endured, the more personal hopes intertwined with ideas of collective change. Some soldiers ventured cautious sentences about respect waiting after victory, or a world in which their sacrifice earned better treatment. Families may have heard these words in many ways, as hints of reforms, as steps toward justice, or even as distant whispers of freedom. In modest inked letters carried overseas, political imagination began to stir. But letters also recorded private longings that carried a different weight. One man wrote of wishing to meet a child born after his departure. Another hoped to bend again over his field and smell soil wet from monsoon rain. These were not grand claims, yet their depth was profound. Such hopes shaped endurance more than orders did. By trusting their families with these images, soldiers transformed memory into motivation. When repeated aloud at home, these hopes became shared visions of survival. Then came the realities of 1918 and after. Many of those hopes faltered. In India, expectations of respect dissolved in 1919 when British troops opened fire on an unarmed crowd at Jallianwala Bagh, killing hundreds. For veterans and families alike, the massacre made clear that loyalty to empire did not guarantee justice. Promises of land or recognition remained unanswered. Letters that once seemed full of anticipation turned, in retrospect, into testimonies of betrayal. In Africa too, disillusionment set in. Returning soldiers brought back medals and uniforms, but not equality. Communities grieved for lives lost and weighed sacrifices against unchanged subjugation. Conversations in villages remembered promises carried in letters, and the gap between those hopes and colonial reality grew only more visible. A page that once spoke of reward became a reminder of how little had been granted. Think of a father in Punjab opening his box of letters years later. He reread lines where his son pledged land would follow service. The war had ended, but no such plot arrived. Instead of bringing pride, those letters now carried quiet bitterness between their lines. Or imagine a community in Senegal welcoming its men home, listening to their stories of hardship abroad, only to find colonial authorities still treating them as subjects first, citizens never. Families continued to recite the words of the old letters, both as comfort and as reminder of what had not come. Yet these disappointments did not erase meaning. They began to shape new politics. Service abroad and sacrifice without recognition made many veterans willing to look beyond empire. former sepoys and tirailleurs returned with sharpened awareness of the wider world, and with memories of unequal treatment engraved on their daily lives. Families, reminded by the words kept in their trunks, knew that promises were broken. Together, their discontent flowed into the early streams of nationalist movements. The bridge from private letters to politics was not immediate, but it was steady. Personal pledges for land, for dignity, for fair treatment, gathered into community memory. Leaders emerging in later decades found those stories alive in households, fueling the demand for self-determination. Scholars note that veterans became active in protests, especially in India, where men who had fought under British flags now joined organisations resisting colonial controls. In Africa too, discontent remembered from wartime letters surfaced in campaigns for reform. Seen this way, disappointment was not only an end, but a beginning. The ink of promises that never materialized became a record of injustice, folded into family memory and gradually extended into national memory. The emphasis on duty and fairness in letters provided language for later movements. What soldiers asked for, security, dignity, recognition, remained at the center of demands when independence unfolded across decades to come. It is this continuity that matters. When families repeated aloud the promises their sons had written, about debts repaid, land secured, respect gained, they held on to dreams larger than the envelope that carried them. Those scattered hopes gave communities a shared vocabulary of expectation. Even when history failed them, the words survived as quiet blueprints for change. Reading those pages now, we see not manifestos, but the raw outlines of futures. Ordinary sentences about marriage feasts preserved, about fields awaiting a plough, about dignity asked for in cautious lines, all led toward the question, if our blood was demanded for empire, what justice is owed in peace? In that question lies the connection between private correspondence and the shape of a national awakening. Families remembered, a memory carried weight. Scholars who study these letters hear voices not trying to dominate history, but trying to secure modest survival. And yet, in those modest phrases lay the foundations for broader struggles. The shift from household hope to political demand was gradual, but it began there in the words written at dusk in trenches or tents, addressed not to empire, but to home. The story of these hopes does not close neatly. They remain both inspiration and lament, evidence of resilience and reminders of disappointment. To hear them today is to glimpse not only what men wished, but what their families built upon in decades after. They teach us that private letters were never private alone. They seeded the conversations that shaped public futures. When we gather these letters into narrative once more, they open a fuller picture of the global war. Not only battles and treaties, but the lives of men who imagined more than their service permitted. Their words across oceans fill gaps in official histories. Listen closely to them, and you will hear the foundations of change resting quietly under the noise of empire. And in that listening, we come to the threshold of memory itself, the place where words once filtered by censors, once smoothed onto fragile pages, remain to remind us how much of a world was built on sacrifice too easily set aside. These letters remind us of three things at once. The war was global in its reach and human in its texture. Censorship shaped but could not erase what soldiers tried to say, and the hopes folded inside small pages later fueled political change after 1918. Their sentence is about food, prayer, and longing, hold as much truth as official reports of battles. For those who want to explore further, many of these letters survive today in archives, some digitised in the British Library's India Office records and the National Archives. Picture a soldier at dusk folding his note with tired hands before posting it home.